My name is Sergeant Reagan Cole, and I am 27 years old, a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. The afternoon they pinned a medal to my chest at Joint Base Palmetto was supposed to be the proudest moment of my life. Instead, it became the moment I learned that the war I thought I'd escaped had simply been waiting patiently for the one day I'd finally let my guard down. I was standing at parade rest on the reviewing stand, the citation from my Army Commendation Medal still echoing off the loudspeakers, when I saw him rise from the third row of folding chairs. Warren Kessler, my stepfather. He wasn't clapping. He was holding a small gift box wrapped in silver paper, the kind you might bring to a retirement dinner or a christening. And for 1/2 second I let myself believe he had actually come to be proud of me. Then the box fell open in his hands, and I saw the dull gray glint of metal. The shot cracked across the parade ground like a whip, and a white-hot pain tore through my hip and dropped me half a step before my training caught me. 2 soldiers in the front row, a specialist I didn't even know, and a staff sergeant from the motor pool, were on Kessler before he could even level the barrel a second time, wrestling him to the pavement in a tangle of limbs and shouting. It wasn't calm, it wasn't procedural. It was instinct, raw and immediate, the kind of thing that happens when you put a weapon in the middle of several hundred people who have spent their whole adult lives training to close distance on a threat, not run from one. I heard his voice anyway, thin and reedy under the chaos. You were never anything without me. Blood was already blooming dark across the blue of my dress uniform trousers. But I brought my hand up to my brow anyway, fingers trembling, and I held the salute until the flag stopped shaking in front of my eyes. He thought that bullet was an ending. It was the first shot in a war he had already lost. If you've ever had someone who was supposed to love you try to take you apart in public, let me know where you're watching from today. And if this story means something to you, stay with me to the end. I should tell you now, before I take you back to where all of this started, that this isn't really a story about a gunshot. I've had 1.5 years since that afternoon to think about what it's actually a story about, and I keep landing on the same answer. It's a story about the particular kind of silence that gets mistaken for peace inside a family and what it finally takes to break it. It's about the difference between a man who builds you up in front of a crowd and a man who builds you up when no one else is watching. And it's about what happens when the people you least expect, a general who never met you before that day, a mother who spent 20 years looking away, finally decide to stop looking away. The heat on that parade ground had been a living thing all morning, pressing down through the wool of my service uniform, but I hadn't minded it. Pride is heavier than heat, and I had earned every ounce of what I was carrying that day. 3 years of training, 1 long deployment supporting a NATO partnership mission overseas, and 20 years before that of simply surviving. I had scanned the crowd before the ceremony began, the way I scan any room now, out of habit, cataloging faces. Hundreds of them, soldiers and families and neighbors, blurred into a single wall of goodwill. Except for 2. My mother Diane sat with a smile pulled so tight across her face it looked like it might crack down the middle. Beside her, Warren Kessler wasn't smiling at all. He was watching me with the same expression he'd worn my entire childhood, the look of a man inventorying something he owned. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the war was over, that I had already won by simply becoming Sergeant Reagan Cole, decorated soldier, a woman he could no longer touch. I was wrong. I had only left the house. I had never left the war. The scent that pulled me backward through time wasn't gunpowder. It was cut grass after a summer storm, the smell of a 2-story house on a quiet street outside Goose Creek, South Carolina, where the lawns were clipped to regulation height and the flags on the porches flew a little too proudly, as if daring anyone to look too closely at what happened behind the front doors. My father, Master Sergeant Daniel Cole, died in a training accident when I was 8 years old. I don't remember much of him directly anymore. I remember the shape of his absence more than the man himself, the way a missing tooth is more present than the one still in your mouth. What I do remember is my mother's grief and how Warren Kessler arrived in the middle of it like a man walking into a house fire with a bucket, already being thanked before anyone checked whether the bucket had water in it. He was, by every outward measure, a pillar of Goose Creek, a local contractor who'd built half the strip malls in the county. A man who wrote checks to the Veterans Association every single year, who stood at the front of every base fundraiser with his hand extended and his smile switched on, who had over more than a decade made himself so useful to Joint Base Palmetto's community outreach programs that his name was practically laminated onto the visitor badge printer. Everyone loved Warren Kessler. Nobody had ever seen what I saw behind our own front door. It started small, the way these things always do. Whispered corrections to my mother when he thought I was out of earshot. "Diane, you can't let her sulk like that. It makes us look bad." And my mother, who had already been worn thin by grief, would just nod. He never seemed to hate anything I did. He hated the things I loved, specifically, deliberately, as if joy itself were a kind of theft from him. I want to be clear about something because I've spent years trying to explain it to people who only ever saw the version of Warren Kessler that stood at the podium during the base's 4th of July barbecue, or the version that shook hands at the Rotary Club breakfast. The cruelty was never loud in public. It was a private language built entirely out of small, deniable moments. A hand that gripped my shoulder a little too hard while he smiled for a photograph. A comment about my weight, delivered so gently at a dinner table full of guests that anyone overhearing it would have sworn he was simply concerned. "She's just sensitive," he'd tell people, shaking his head with theatrical patience, and they would nod along, because who doubts a man who volunteers to coach the youth football team and personally funds the base's holiday toy drive every December? In 7th grade, I built a papier-mâché volcano for the school science fair and won first place. I brought the blue ribbon home and set the volcano on the shelf in the living room, and for one evening I let myself feel something like pride. The next morning it lay in pieces on the floor. "Clumsy me," he said, not even looking up from his coffee. When I was 16, I saved 3 months of tips from a diner job to buy a navy blue dress for the spring dance. I loved that dress. I felt, for the first time in years, almost beautiful in it. He walked into my room without knocking the night of the dance, looked at me for a long moment, and told me it was inappropriate. Then he took a pair of scissors from my desk and cut it into ribbons in front of me while I stood there and said nothing, because I had already learned that saying something only made it worse. But the diary was the cruelest. He found it under my mattress and didn't destroy it right away. He waited. Weeks later at the dinner table with my mother pouring sweet tea like nothing was happening, he pulled it out and read my private thoughts aloud, mocking every fear and every small foolish dream I'd ever written down. While I sat frozen and burning with a shame that felt like it was melting the skin off my face, I looked at my mother. I begged her with my eyes to do something. She looked down at her plate and stirred her tea. That silence hurt worse than anything he ever said directly to me. I came home 5 minutes past curfew once, and he shoved me hard enough that I tumbled down the short flight of stairs to the living room. I looked up through tears and found my mother standing in the kitchen doorway. "You shouldn't have made Warren angry," she said, and turned away. That was the day I understood that silence isn't neutral. Silence is a decision, and she had made hers. There was a stray dog that summer, a scrawny thing with a torn ear that used to follow me home from the school bus stop. I fed it scraps behind the shed for almost 2 months before Kessler found out. I never even got to name it. He told me weak things had no place in his house, and the next day, the dog was simply gone, and no amount of asking where would get me an answer. I learned, that week, to stop asking questions I already knew the answers to. My father's flag, folded into its triangle case, sat on a shelf in the hallway closet for years, one of the only things of his Kessler never touched, though I sometimes wondered if that was mercy or simple indifference. I used to sneak into that closet late at night, when the house had finally gone quiet, and sit on the floor with the case in my lap, tracing the stitched stars with my fingertip. I didn't remember much about my father directly, but I remembered that flag and the particular kind of stillness it gave me that nothing else in that house ever did. I think, looking back, that closet was the first place I ever understood what safety was supposed to feel like. Small, dark, and entirely mine. He was careful, too, about how he spent his cruelty in front of an audience. At my middle school graduation, he stood beaming beside my mother, his arm around her shoulders, telling the other parents how proud he was of his girl. And I remember standing there in my cap and gown, feeling like a prop in someone else's photograph. On the drive home, in the privacy of the car, he told me I'd slouched during the ceremony and embarrassed him in front of people who mattered to his business. 2 versions of the same man, separated by nothing but a car door. By the time I was 17, I had built an entire second self just to survive inside that house, quiet, agreeable, invisible whenever possible, the kind of daughter who gave him nothing to correct. It is a strange, exhausting kind of discipline, learning to disappear inside your own home. I didn't know yet that it would turn out to be useful training for something else entirely. The Army wasn't a career choice for me. It was an escape route with a uniform attached. I ran every morning before the fog lifted off our street, not for fitness, but for distance, each step a small rebellion against a house that had never once felt like mine. I kept maps and workout schedules hidden under my bed in the same spot where he had once found my diary. When my enlistment papers arrived, they felt heavier than paper has any right to feel. They felt like a key. He sneered at me once, not long before I left. "You'll never get away from me." He didn't understand. I wasn't planning to run. I was planning to come back stronger than anything he could ever throw at me. Basic training at Fort Jackson was its own kind of brutal, but it was a brutality with a purpose, and that distinction changed something in me almost immediately. The drill sergeants screamed the way Kessler used to sneer, but when I failed a task, they made me do it again and again until I got it right, instead of using my failure as a weapon to keep. Drill Sergeant Alvarez, barely 5'4", and built like she could bench press a Humvee, gathered our platoon one afternoon after a brutal training exercise and told us in a voice hoarse from 3 straight days of shouting, "We push you so that when the bullets start flying, you hear our voice over your own fear." That wasn't cruelty, that was preparation. For the first time in my life, discipline felt like someone trying to keep me alive instead of trying to keep me small. The first 2 weeks nearly broke me, though not in the way I expected. It wasn't the physical exhaustion, though there was plenty of that, it was the noise. The barracks smelled of sweat and boot polish and pine cleaner, and the shouting started before dawn and didn't let up until long after the lights should have gone out. Every time a drill sergeant barked at me for a sloppy push-up or a crooked bunk, some old reflex in my chest flinched the way it used to flinch at the sound of Kessler's footsteps on the stairs. There were nights I lay on my bunk under a scratchy wool blanket, staring at the metal frame of the bed above me, wondering if I had simply traded one place that yelled at me for another. But slowly, I noticed the difference, the way you notice a change in weather before you can name it. When I failed a task at Fort Jackson, nobody used it to remind me of every other failure I'd ever had. They made me do it again and again until I got it right. There was no keeping score of my shortcomings to use against me later at a dinner table. There was only the task in front of me and the next one after that. There was a girl in my platoon named Naomi Chase from the Bronx, tough enough that most of the drill sergeants left her alone out of what I can only describe as professional respect. She barely spoke 3 words at a time. One evening, after I dislocated my shoulder on the obstacle course and a drill sergeant barked something thoughtless about a boyfriend waiting for me back home, a comment that landed on an old wound he had no way of knowing about, I sat alone in the mess hall, arm in a sling picking at food I couldn't taste. Naomi sat down across from me without a word and slid her untouched pudding cup across the table. "Eat," she said. "You'll need it tomorrow." I don't know how to explain what that small, wordless kindness did to 20 years of isolation. It cracked something open. For the first time, I understood that if I fell here, someone might actually pick me up. The day I fired my first tight grouping on the range, Drill Sergeant Alvarez leaned in close and told me, "Don't fight the weapon, Cole. Become part of it. Breathe. Squeeze. It's all you." I thought of Kessler's smug, sneering face and let it dissolve, focusing instead on my breath, on the mechanics, on control that belonged to me and no one else. 3 rounds landed in a tight cluster. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the person something was being done to. I was the one holding the power, and I was learning to hold it with discipline. Naomi and I stayed close through the rest of training, and something about her steady, unimpressed presence taught me more than any lecture could have about what a real bond looks like, not conditional on my being useful or agreeable just there. The way she'd slid that pudding cup across the table without asking anything in return. By the time our platoon graduated, I understood that I wasn't just becoming a soldier. I was becoming a person who had never existed inside that house on the quiet street in Goose Creek. Someone whose worth wasn't up for renegotiation every time she walked through a door. Lying in a hospital bed years later, a bullet wound throbbing in my hip, I understood the terrible irony of that memory. I had learned to master a weapon with honor, only to be shot by a man who understood nothing about honor at all. The days after the shooting blurred into white walls and antiseptic smells. Physically, I was safe. My mind was still a battlefield. One quiet afternoon, a knock came at my door, and instead of a nurse, Brigadier General Thomas Ashford walked in wearing a plain navy polo instead of his uniform, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the hospital shop. I tried to sit up and salute out of pure reflex, my body protesting sharply. He raised a hand before I could finish the motion. "At ease, Sergeant. That's an order." We talked for what felt like hours, and he never once asked about the shooting. He asked about my deployment overseas, about the soldiers I'd served with, about Drill Sergeant Alvarez and what she'd taught me. Eventually, hesitating, my voice cracking, I told him something I had never said out loud. I feel ashamed. Like somehow getting shot was my fault. His expression went stern, but his eyes stayed gentle. "Sergeant, the only person who should feel shame here is the coward who attacked an unarmed soldier at her own award ceremony. You do not carry another person's shame. That was never yours to hold." Then, quietly, he told me something I hadn't known. "I served under your father for 2 years, Sergeant Cole." Master Sergeant Daniel Cole was one of the finest non-commissioned officers I ever worked alongside. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to look after his daughter, I would. He paused. "Your father would be proud of you today, and so am I." That sentence broke something in me that I had spent 20 years building brick by careful brick. I wept for the girl who broke a volcano and had a dress cut to ribbons, and a diary read aloud at the dinner table. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel weak for crying. A few days later, his wife, Susan Ashford, visited with a thermos of homemade soup and a worn paperback of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply sat, knitting quietly, telling me funny stories about her husband as a young lieutenant nearly burning down their first kitchen, trying to cook Thanksgiving dinner. "Thomas told me you're one of the bravest soldiers he's ever met," she said. "But you're allowed to be weak in here too. Healing takes rest, not just resilience." She came back 3 more times that week, always with something small and specific: a paperback, a tin of shortbread, a photograph once of my father in his dress uniform standing beside a much younger General Ashford at some long-forgotten formation, both of them squinting into the sun. "Thomas kept that one in his desk drawer for years," she told me, setting it on my hospital tray. "He said your father was the kind of non-commissioned officer who made everyone else's job easier just by being in the room." I held that photograph for a long time after she left, studying my father's face for pieces of my own. And for the first time since the shooting, I felt something other than fear or grief settle into the space where he used to be. I felt, quietly, like I belonged to something larger than the house I'd grown up in. I asked her once, half joking, whether the general was always this stubbornly kind to strangers. She laughed, a warm, unhurried sound. "You're not a stranger, dear. You never were, not to him. He's been waiting a long time for a chance to keep a promise he made himself a long time ago, ever since your father passed." I understood exactly what she meant. He had already told me himself that first afternoon about serving alongside my father, and hearing it echoed now gently from someone who had watched him carry that promise quietly for nearly 20 years. Made it feel less like a coincidence and more like something that had simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. Before General Ashford was called away, he stood by my bed one last time and told me something that settled deep into my bones. Warren Kessler built a fortress of lies in that town. He convinced an entire community he was a saint. But he made one mistake. He brought his war onto my base, against one of my soldiers. "We do not leave a soldier behind, Sergeant. You will not fight this alone." Special Agent Laura Bishop from Army Criminal Investigation Division introduced herself to me not long after. She was efficient, precise, and entirely without theatrics, and something about that steadiness felt like armor. "Because this incident occurred on federal property during an official military ceremony," she explained. "This case falls under federal jurisdiction. My office is coordinating directly with the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office, Mr. Steely. Kessler will be prosecuted in federal court, Sergeant, not a county courthouse. Federal court." I didn't fully understand yet what that distinction would mean. I would learn. Hope, a feeling I had almost forgotten the shape of, began to flicker weakly back to life. Then I turned on the small television mounted on my hospital wall, and the flicker nearly went out entirely. There, on a local news broadcast, stood a slick, silver-tongued attorney named Victor Lane, speaking into a cluster of microphones outside a courthouse. "This is a tragic family dispute," he said, his face arranged into practiced concern. "Mr. Cott, Kessler is a beloved community figure who was pushed to his limit by a deeply troubled young woman suffering from severe combat-related trauma. The first bullet had torn through my flesh. This one, fired from 1,000 television screens, was aimed straight at my truth. I sat frozen, watching my own story stolen and twisted and repackaged for an audience that had never met me. Local stations began running interviews from Goose Creek. Mrs. Talbot, who used to hand me chocolate chip cookies as a child, looked into the camera and said, "Warren is a wonderful man. He put up with so much from that girl." Mr. Whitfield, who cut our lawn for years, nodded gravely. She always had a wild look about her. Not quite right, if you understand my meaning. These were people who had watched me grow up, who had seen me carry in groceries and walk to the bus stop, and they had only ever seen the mask Kessler built for them and the sullen, difficult stepdaughter he'd invented to explain it. He hadn't just manipulated my mother. He had manipulated an entire town, one favor, one donation, one photo op at a time, and now that town was repeating his lies back to the cameras as if they were their own. I made the mistake, one evening, of reading the comments beneath the news article about the shooting. The anonymity of it was almost worse than Mrs. Talbot's face on camera. She probably provoked him. Real soldiers don't fall apart like this, typical of these veterans looking for a payout. The seeds of doubt were being planted by strangers who had never met me, who knew nothing about the parade ground or the sound of that shot, and I felt them taking root anyway. The way doubt always finds soil, no matter how carefully you think you've paved it over. The nurses on my floor began looking at me differently, too. Not unkind, exactly, but softer around the edges in a way that felt like pity, mixed with something colder, something closer to suspicion. Their conversations at my bedside grew shorter. I felt the walls of that hospital room start to close in the same way the walls of my childhood bedroom used to close in, and I understood with a kind of exhausted clarity that Kessler didn't need to be free to keep hurting me. He only needed a microphone. Then, cutting through the noise like a blade, an official press conference aired live from Joint Base Palmetto. General Ashford stood at the podium in his full uniform, a wall of American flags behind him. "I will say this once, clearly," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of command. "I witnessed a cowardly act of violence committed against a decorated non-commissioned officer on the very day she was being honored for her service to this nation." The salute Sergeant Cole rendered while bleeding from a gunshot wound was not theater. It was the purest definition of honor this Army teaches. Sergeant Cole is a credit to this uniform and to this country. Any suggestion otherwise is a falsehood, and we will see that justice is served. He didn't take a single question. He simply turned and walked off the stage, and something in the tide of public opinion shifted with him. I switched off the television, my own tired reflection staring back at me from the dark screen. He could have the cameras. He could have the neighbors. He would not have my truth. The trial began months later at the United States District Court, not the county courthouse Kessler's team had clearly hoped for. Assistant United States Attorney Patricia Reyes led the prosecution, sharp, unhurried, and utterly unshaken by Victor Lane's polished theatrics. The charge, she explained to me plainly before the first day began, was assault with intent to commit murder on federal property, a charge that carried consequences far heavier than anything a state court could offer. Kessler arrived each day in an expensive charcoal suit, looking more like a man on his way to a board meeting than a defendant facing federal prison. Lane paraded Mrs. Talbot and Mr. Talbot, Whitfield to the stand, and they repeated their rehearsed lines about a troubled, unstable young woman. I sat at the prosecution table, hands clenched in my lap, feeling the walls close in the way they used to in that dining room in Goose Creek. AUSA Reyes opened the government's case by walking the jury through the timeline with a precision that felt almost surgical. She played the ceremony footage first, not the dramatic slow-motion version the news networks had looped for weeks, but the raw feed, unedited, letting the jury watch in real time as the gift box opened as I staggered. As two soldiers who had never met Warren Kessler in their lives closed the distance on him before he could raise the weapon a second time. This was not a family dispute, she told the jury in her opening. This was a premeditated act of violence carried out against a decorated non-commissioned officer on federal property in front of her chain of command. The evidence will show exactly how Mr. Pruvens Kessler gained access to that ceremony and exactly how long he planned to be there. Special Agent Bishop had already walked me through what that meant weeks earlier, sitting across from me at a plain government issue table with a folder of photographs and timestamps. Kessler's donor badge had gotten him past the outer checkpoint without the pat-down every other guest received that day. The gift box, wrapped and ribboned like something meant for a retirement party, had never been so much as glanced at by the volunteers managing the gift table. It shouldn't have worked, Bishop told me, not unkindly, just factually. And it's not going to work again. The base has already rewritten the donor access policy because of what happened to you. During a recess, I pulled out the worn copy of Meditations Susan Ashford had given me and found the line I'd underlined so many times the ink had started to fade. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. I held on to it like a lifeline. During a recess, I pulled out the worn copy of Meditation Susan Ashford had given me and found the line I'd underlined so many times the ink had started to fade. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. I held on to it like a lifeline. The prosecution calls Diane Cole to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. My mother rose, small and fragile, in a beige cardigan 2 sizes too big, and made her way to the witness stand. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she took the oath. She kept her eyes down, avoiding both Kessler and me. Then Victor Lane approached, his voice dripping with rehearsed sweetness. "Mrs. Cole, you love your daughter, don't you?" "Yes," she whispered. "Then can you explain to this jury why you'd allow her to fabricate such stories about your husband? A man who has provided for you both?" She flinched as if struck. I felt my chest tighten, certain she was about to fold the way she always had. Lane leaned in, sensing weakness. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Cole, that perhaps you were jealous of the attention your husband gave your daughter?" The room went silent enough to hear the air conditioning cycle on. My mother slowly lifted her head. For the first time in 20 years, she looked directly at Warren Kessler, and the fear that had lived permanently in her eyes was simply gone. "He is not a good man," she said, her voice steady now, gaining strength with every word. "He is a monster." She described the volcano, the dress, the diary, a knife taken to a basketball because I'd come home late one summer evening. "And I stood by and watched," she said, her voice breaking. "I was a coward. I was too afraid to stop him. I will not be afraid anymore." Kessler's mask shattered in real time. "You lie," he shouted, lunging to his feet before the bailiffs restrained him. "I gave you everything. You owe me." The jury watched, stunned, as the calm businessman disintegrated into exactly the man my mother had just described. In the chaos, as they wrestled him toward the door, his eyes found mine one last time. "You took everything from me," he spat. I met his gaze and felt, for the first time in my life, no fear at all. "You never had anything that was truly yours to take," I said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. Special Agent Bishop testified next, methodical and precise, laying out the timeline of the investigation for the jury the same way she had laid it out for me weeks before. How the weapon had been concealed inside a gift box. How Kessler's long-standing status as a base donor had allowed him access without the standard visitor screening most guests received. Lane tried to suggest in cross-examination that this was an institutional failure that had nothing to do with his client's intent. Bishop didn't take the bait. "Mr. Kessler didn't stumble into that gap by accident, counselor," she said evenly. "Our investigation found he had attended 11 prior base events using that same donor credential over 6 years. He knew exactly what that badge would and wouldn't get checked. That's not an accident. That's reconnaissance." It was not a comfortable fact for the base to admit publicly, but Bishop stated it plainly, and afterward the base's own security protocols for VIP donor access were formally revised. It was a small thing beside everything else, but it mattered to me because it meant no one else would fall through that same gap the way I had. Then General Ashford took the stand. Every person in the courtroom, including the judge, seemed to straighten in their seats. "In 30 years of service," he told the jury, "I have witnessed courage in many forms. I have seen soldiers run into gunfire for a fallen comrade. And on that parade ground, I watched a sergeant who had just been shot by a member of her own family choose to finish her duty and render a proper salute. That was not theater, ladies and gentlemen. That was the truest form of honor I have ever witnessed. Lane tried one desperate angle. General, isn't it possible your personal feelings for the sergeant have clouded your judgment? Ashford turned his head slowly, his gaze dropping the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. Counselor, my judgment was forged over 3 decades of service to this country. I know precisely how to distinguish courage from cowardice. I saw both on that field. Lane had nothing left. No further questions. The jury deliberated for hours that felt longer than my entire deployment. When the foreman finally stood, his voice was steady. Guilty. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples moved through the whole room. My mother let out a sob beside me, not of grief, but of release. Kessler collapsed into himself, screaming that everyone had betrayed him, that the world owed him, and the bailiffs dragged him out, still shouting, down the marble hallway. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Veterans, strangers, people who had simply followed my story and needed to see how it ended. A group of women in veteran caps and jackets held a hand-painted banner, Sergeant Cole, honor, courage, resilience. A reporter pushed a microphone toward me. Sergeant, how do you feel right now? Free, I said, and I meant it. Sentencing came 6 weeks later in the same federal courtroom, under a different kind of quiet. AUSA read the guidelines into the record, the assault charge enhanced by the fact that the offense had occurred on federal property against a service member performing official duties, carried a mandatory minimum well beyond anything a state court could have imposed. Judge Marsh, an older man with a voice that never once rose above a measured, even register, listened to victim impact statements from both my mother and me before he spoke. I hadn't planned to say much when it was my turn. I stood at the podium with a single index card of notes and found, once I started speaking, that I didn't need them. I told the court about the volcano and the dress and the diary, not because the court hadn't already heard those details during the trial, but because a sentencing hearing felt like the one place left where those small, specific cruelties deserved to be spoken plainly without a defense attorney allowed to twist them into something else. This isn't about revenge, Your Honor, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. It's about making sure the next person he might have decided he owned never gets the chance to find out what that costs. Kessler stared straight ahead the entire time I spoke, his jaw tight, and did not once meet my eyes. Mr. Kessler, he said, looking down over his glasses, this court has heard over the course of this trial a portrait of a man who spent 2 decades constructing an elaborate public reputation, specifically so that no one would believe the private one. That is not merely a personal failing. In the context of what happened on that parade ground, it is an aggravating factor this court takes seriously. He sentenced Kessler to 22 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release before serving at least 85% of that term under federal sentencing guidelines. It wasn't a number that undid anything, but it was, finally, a number with teeth. There was one piece of business left. Special Agent Bishop met with me and my attorney the following week and laid a folder on the table. We recovered correspondence Kessler attempted to have delivered to you through a third party after sentencing in direct violation of the no-contact order the court issued, she said. This, combined with the letter, gives us grounds to petition for a lifetime protective order, and it opens him to additional federal charges for violating that order. I thought of the trinkets in the old wooden box at the back of my closet, of every scrap of him I had once tried to keep contained instead of confronted. This time, I didn't hesitate. Use it, I said. Use all of it. The court granted the lifetime order within a month. Kessler's attempt to reach me from behind bars didn't get him a moment of my attention. It got him another federal charge, and it closed off, permanently and in writing, any door he might have imagined was still cracked open. Somewhere in the middle of all that paperwork, I actually laughed. A short, disbelieving huff of a laugh at the thought that the man who once told me I'd never get away from him had just handed federal prosecutors the exact evidence that would keep him from ever reaching me again. The months after the verdict were quieter, and quiet, I learned, is its own kind of hard. The cameras packed up. The phone calls slowed. I came home each night to 4 walls and the particular silence of a wound that had closed on the outside but was still very much open underneath. My relationship with my mother began again in small, careful steps, like 2 strangers learning to walk beside each other. We took long walks along the river near the base, talking about nothing important, both of us circling the same unspoken 20 years. One afternoon, she stopped walking and turned to me, her eyes wet with a shame that was painful to witness. "Reagan, I am so sorry. I didn't protect you. I was a coward." I could have told her it was fine. It would have been the easy thing, the thing that smooths everything over and buries it right back down where it's been festering for 2 decades. I didn't. "Yes," I said softly. "You were. And it hurt me more than anything he ever did to me directly." She flinched, tears spilling over, but she nodded and accepted it without flinching away from the truth a bit. "But you told the truth when it mattered," I continued, taking her hand. "You stood up in that courtroom. That's a beginning." She didn't stop there either. A few weeks later, she asked if I would come with her to Goose Creek. She wanted, she said, to speak to Mrs. Talbot and Mr. Whitfield herself. I almost didn't go. Some part of me wanted to let that town simply fade into the background of a life I was building somewhere else. But I understood, watching my mother's face as she asked, that this wasn't really about the neighbors. It was about her finally practicing what it felt like to stand up in a room instead of shrinking inside one. We drove out on a Saturday morning, the same route I used to run every dawn as a teenager, past the same clipped lawns and the same 2 proud flags. Mrs. Talbot answered her door in a housecoat, her face going pale the moment she recognized us both standing on her porch together. I stood at the edge of the steps while my mother, and a voice I had never once heard her use inside that house we all used to share, told her former neighbor exactly what had happened behind our closed doors for 20 years. The volcano, the dress the diary read aloud at the dinner table, the dog that disappeared without explanation, and exactly what it had cost her daughter to watch that same neighbor repeat Kessler's lies to a television camera, as if they were simple, uncomplicated fact. Mrs. Talbot's hand went to her collarbone. "I didn't know," she kept saying. "I didn't know it was like that." "You knew enough to wonder," my mother said. Not unkindly, but without backing down either. "You just decided it was easier not to ask." We had the same conversation an hour later on Mr. Jung Whitfield's lawn, the same one he used to mow for us every other Saturday for a flat rate of $20. He didn't argue. He just stood there with his gardening gloves still on, listening, his face reddening slowly, and when my mother finished he said quietly that he'd call the local paper himself and ask them to run a correction. He never did, not exactly, but 2 weeks later a short letter to the editor appeared under his name, walking back his earlier comments and asking the community to consider how quickly convenient stories can replace inconvenient truths. It wasn't a grand reckoning. Nobody got a dramatic public apology on the evening news. But I watched my mother stand on those 2 porches and refused to let either of them look away, and something in me settled that no courtroom verdict had quite managed to reach. She didn't get a scripted retraction. She got something quieter and, I think, harder to give. She made 2 people sit, in daylight, with exactly what their silence and their small careless lies had helped build. On the drive home, my mother was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "I used to think staying quiet was how I protected this family," she said. "I understand now it was never protection. It was just easier for me. I didn't have an answer for that." I just reached over and put my hand on hers on the console between us, and we drove the rest of the way back to base without needing to fill the silence with anything else. I began attending a support group for service members at the VA, sitting in a circle of plastic chairs in a room with no windows. I didn't introduce myself as the woman from the news. I just said, "My name is Reagan. I'm a sergeant." For the first time since the shooting, I wasn't a headline. I was a person among peers who understood that the deepest wounds are usually the ones no one else can see. There was a young specialist in that group, barely 21, who told the room one week that he hadn't spoken to his own father in 3 years because every phone call ended with the same old wound reopened. I recognized something in the way he talked around the edges of it, careful, practiced, the way you learn to describe pain you've decided the world isn't ready to hear about directly. After the session, I told him about the wooden box in my closet, about the letter I never mailed. He didn't say much back, but the next week he came again. And the week after that. Some doors opened slowly, one small honest sentence at a time, and I was starting to understand that healing rarely announces itself. It just shows up, quietly, in a windowless room on a Tuesday evening and stays. One evening, my mother, in a moment of well-meaning but misguided hope for closure, asked if I might ever consider visiting Kessler in prison. "People can change, honey," she said. "Maybe he's different now." I took a slow breath before answering. "Mom, forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. I can work toward forgiving him for my own peace, not his. But that does not mean I let him back into my life in any form. Some doors have to stay closed forever." I thought of something I'd read once, a line attributed to Maya Angelou: "When someone shows you who they are, believe them." Kessler had shown me 1,000 times over. I finally believed him. A letter did arrive eventually, smuggled through a third party the way Agent Bishop had warned me it might. 10 pages of blame. My mother was weak, his lawyer was incompetent, the general was biased, and above everyone else, I was the architect of his downfall. The final line was seared into me instantly: "You destroyed my life, and you will rot for it." I waited for rage. Instead, something closer to pity settled over me. He was a man so consumed by his own reflection that he would spend the rest of his life as the villain and the victim in the same unchanging story. Long after his sentence ended, I wrote him a response. Pages of it, everything I had never said, 20 years compressed into ink. When I finished, my hand ached and my face was wet. I never mailed it. I folded it, set it in a small metal bowl in my kitchen sink, and struck a match. I watched the words curl into black ash, and I understood, watching them go, that silence would be my final answer to him. Not the frightened silence of a child on a staircase, but the deliberate, chosen silence of a woman who no longer needed his attention to know her own worth. I placed the letter he'd sent, not mine, his, inside the old wooden box in my closet, alongside the last few relics of Goose Creek, and closed the lid. The past wasn't erased. It was simply, finally, contained. Physical recovery was its own long road. Some mornings, the pain in my hip felt like a grinding, permanent reminder of everything that had happened. I treated physical therapy like a mission, the same discipline that carried me through basic training, one small victory at a time. When I was finally cleared for full duty and walked back into my unit's headquarters, I braced for pity. It never came. Instead, I found quiet nods, firmer handshakes, the particular respect soldiers reserve for someone who has faced down a different kind of enemy and refused to fall. That respect settled into something larger inside me. My own survival, I realized, wasn't the end of the story. It felt too small to be the whole point. I began volunteering weekends at a shelter serving military families dealing with domestic violence in the Palmetto area. In those quiet conversations with spouses and fellow service members, I recognized my own reflection in their eyes. I understood, in a way few people could, the particular prison of being hurt inside a culture that prizes strength and silence above almost everything else. How do you ask for help when your whole world tells you to be unbreakable? How do you report abuse that comes from inside the very community meant to protect you? I brought a detailed proposal to General Ashford before his retirement. 3 typed pages I'd rewritten a dozen times, at my kitchen table, complete with a rough budget, a staffing plan built around volunteer hours, and a list of the exact protections I wanted written into policy so that no soldier who called in would ever have to worry about it costing them their career. A confidential, peer-led support network for service members and their families facing domestic abuse, a place where a soldier could speak to another soldier without fear of career consequences. He read through it twice, slowly, at his desk, while I sat across from him, trying not to fidget the way I used to when Kessler read through report cards looking for something to correct. When he finally looked up, there was nothing to correct in his expression at all. He didn't hesitate. "This isn't just a good idea, Sergeant, it's a necessary one. You have my full support." We called it the Silent Comrade Network. It began as a simple hotline and a weekly support circle in a borrowed conference room with folding chairs and a coffee maker that never quite worked right, and it grew, quietly but steadily, into a resource soldiers actually trusted. Within the first year, we had fielded calls from spouses too frightened to say the word abuse out loud, from junior enlisted service members convinced that reporting a problem at home would end a career they'd worked too hard for, from people who, like me, had simply never had anyone ask them the right question at the right moment. We weren't just offering help. We were changing what silence was allowed to mean inside a culture that had for too long mistaken silence for strength. My mother started volunteering there too, answering phones 2 evenings a week. She never once used her own story to make a point with a caller, but I could hear it in the particular gentleness of her voice through the thin conference room wall. The voice of someone who understood now. exactly what it cost to stay quiet, and exactly what it could give someone else to finally not have to. I still remember the first call that came through our hotline late one Tuesday night, months before we had any real system in place, just a borrowed cell phone and a legal pad. It was a young Army spouse, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if it was really true that calling could get her husband's security clearance pulled, or if that was just something she'd always been told to keep her quiet. I told her the truth, that reporting abuse and ruining a career are not the same thing, that the Army has procedures built specifically to separate accountability from retaliation, and that she was allowed to be safe without being made to feel responsible for someone else's consequences. She didn't give me her name. She called back twice more over the following month, and the third time, her voice sounded different, steadier, less like someone bracing for impact. I never found out what happened to her after that, but I think about her more than almost anyone else from that whole year, because she was the first proof I had that silent comrade wasn't just a good idea on paper. It was already, quietly, doing exactly what I'd hoped it would. 1 year to the day after I was shot, I stood on that same parade ground again. This time, the air didn't carry any tension at all, just warm afternoon light and something close to peace. I was there to be named the base's Soldier of the Year, not for what I had survived, but for what I had built afterward. General Ashford, in one of his final acts before retirement, pinned the new medal to my chest and leaned in close. "I told you your father would be proud," he said, his voice thick. "So am I, Sergeant." "So am I." I returned his salute with a steady hand, and then I walked to the podium. I looked out at the faces before me, fellow soldiers, people who had found the courage to call our hotline, and in the front row, my mother, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since I was a very small girl. "1 year ago, on this field, I was wounded," I began, my voice clear. "Many of you have called the salute I gave that day an act of bravery, but today I want to talk about the scar the bullet left behind." I touched my hip through the fabric of my uniform. For a long time I saw this scar as proof that I was broken. I since learned that our scars aren't endings. They aren't periods. They're commas, places where a new, often stronger sentence begins. I let the silence hold for a moment. I've learned that real courage isn't standing alone in your darkest moment. Real courage is what you do after that moment. It's reaching back into the dark to build a place where no one else has to stand there alone. In the Army, we live by a promise. I will never leave a fallen comrade. That promise shouldn't end the moment we take off the uniform. It has to follow us home. It has to reach the battles no one else can see. For a moment, the entire parade ground stood in silence. Then it rose together into a wave of applause that didn't feel like celebration so much as recognition. The sound of an entire community agreeing to carry something they had once let one man carry alone. Afterward, as the crowd slowly dispersed across the field, Naomi Chase found me near the reviewing stand, out of uniform now, having driven 6 hours just to be there. She didn't say anything profound. She just handed me a chocolate pudding cup, the same brand from the Fort Jackson mess hall, and said, "Figured you'd earned it by now." I laughed harder than the moment probably called for, and for a second the whole weight of the last year lifted just enough that I could feel how light I actually was underneath it. My mother found me a few minutes later, and for once, neither of us reached for words right away. We just stood together at the edge of that field watching soldiers and families mill past us in the late afternoon light. And I thought about the little girl who used to run through fog before dawn just to put distance between herself and a house that never felt safe. She would not have believed this field could ever feel like this. Neither would I, most days, if I hadn't lived through getting here. Susan Ashford found us both a little later, no longer knitting, but still somehow carrying that same unhurried warmth with her wherever she went. She pressed a small paper bag into my hands. Shortbread, of course, the same kind she brought to the hospital more than a year earlier. "Thomas retired last spring," she said, "but he made me promise to be here today no matter what. He's around here somewhere, pretending not to be emotional about it." I found him a few minutes later, near the flagpole, out of uniform for the first time since I'd met him, watching the crowd with the same quiet, watchful stillness he'd carried into my hospital room that first afternoon. He didn't say much when I thanked him. He just nodded once, the same sharp, economical nod he'd given me outside that federal courtroom, and I understood it the same way I had then. Mission accomplished, Sergeant. The bloody salute of a year earlier wasn't just a memory of survival anymore. It had become something else entirely, a promise, passed hand to hand, that our deepest wounds don't have to define us. They can become the reason we finally understand exactly what we're fighting for. Thank you for walking this road with me. If any part of this story found you where you are, hit that like button. And if you found your own kind of strength on the other side of something that tried to break, you tell me in one word in the comments below what that strength has come to mean to you.